So setting up forms in pretty much any framework is a bit of a challenge, and that's especially true with React. And there are different libraries available for you to actually help you set up a form and handle the submission process as well. So in this tutorial, we're going to take a look at one such library called Formik. So we're going to set up a newsletter sign-up form, and we're going to take some user input. We're actually going to put some validation on top of that as well, and then handle a submission process. And just as a cherry on the top, what we're going to do is submit that to a mail service called MailChimp, where we can actually store that sign-up information when the user fills out the newsletter sign-up form. So let's head on over to VS Code and start coding up our newsletter sign-up form using the Formik library.
Okay, so we're going to do this tutorial in 3 sections really. We're going to first of all build a really simple form using the Formik library, and then we're going to layer on some validation, again using Formik, and then at the end we'll handle the submission of the form using Formik's built-in tools, and what we'll actually do is pass that to the MailChimp API, which will handle the submission of the user signing up to the newsletter. So the main point of the tutorial is to introduce you to Formik and get you using it, but also to make it a bit more interesting, we've got this MailChimp submission, which we'll actually handle with a Netlify function or a Lambda function. So once we've completed the project, it should be pretty much ready to go to be deployed to Netlify itself. Okay, so there is a repository that goes along with this tutorial. I'll put a link to it in the description below. And if you do go ahead and clone that repository, just go along to the setup branch, and what you'll get is basically a complete React app that's been configured to use a few things, including Tailwind and also Netlify Lambda, so that we can write that function a bit later on. So what I'm going to do first of all is get our app up and running, and you can see here we've got a script which is npm run start :app, and for later on also we've got a start command for the API as well, but we'll leave that just for the moment. So let's get our app up and running. And essentially what we've got over in the browser now is an empty React app ready for us to start creating our newsletter sign-up form. Okay, so let's actually go ahead and set that up now. I'm going to create a new file in our project. I'm using TypeScript with the Create React App package for this project. So let's create a file called signupform.tsx, and this will basically be a component that holds the sign-up form for us. So let's first of all import React. And then let's create this sign up form function for our components. So let's just create an empty function to start off with, and let's just return a simple bit of JSX, just so we've got some placeholder stuff here. And then finally just export this as a default property from this file. Okay, and with that created, let's go into the main app.tsx file that we've got here. And you can see we've got a root element that we're rendering at the moment. And let's actually just render this sign up form. I'll make sure we import it from the right place. And there you go, you can see in our page at the moment we've got the component being rendered successfully. Okay, so that's just a bit of placeholder just to get us started, and you can see things updating when we update this component. Okay, so the repository should already have Formik installed, but if you just want to install it, it's just a simple command, npm install, and then Formik. But I won't do that. As I say, it's already installed in this repository. But what I am going to do is import some things from the Formik library. So I'm going to import Formik itself. There's a property called Formik in the package, and we're going to import a few things as well. We're going to be using the form component, the field component, and in a short while we'll be looking at error messages when we do our validation as well. And the other thing is Formik helpers as well, which is just an interface that we'll use when we're actually submitting the form. And the other thing, as mentioned in the start of the tutorial, I'm also going to import Yup as well. Again, you just need to do npm install Yup if you're following along in a different way, but it's already installed in this repository. And Yup will be used for creating our schema for our validation, and it's very much like Joy if you've ever used that on the backend in a Node application. But don't worry, I'll go through how the schema creation and usage works in just a moment when we move on to validation. But the first thing we really want to do is get a form up and running and see how we use Formik to do that. Okay, so let's get rid of our heading level 2 tag that we had there to start off with. And the first thing I'm going to do in our sign up form is use the Formik component to be rendered in our sign up form. And this is kind of like the container component for the form, and you can put all of the properties and events for the form in here as well. And in fact, you'll see there is actually an error at the moment because it needs a couple of required props to be passed in there. And the first one is initial values, which I'll just pass in as an empty object for the moment. And the other required thing is we need to pass an onSubmit prop in as well. So what happens when the user submits the form? So we'll just pass that the name of a function for the moment. And if we just create that up here, and it will just be literally an empty function at the moment, just so we don't get any errors within Visual Studio Code. Okay, so that's the containing Formik component set up for us. We actually now need to put another component inside there for the actual form itself. We're actually going to add the input components in a second, but just to mention, you can actually put any kind of HTML or JSX, I guess, inside of here as well. So let's put a header inside of there. So this will be the title of our form. Okay, so we've got our form set up, but we haven't actually got any fields in there at the moment, any input boxes. So I'm going to add 3 fields to this newsletter sign up form. And we do that just by using the field component that we imported before. And we need to pass a name prop to it, which is actually used to update the state in the field. Then we're going to call it first name. Because we're using Tailwind as well, I'm going to add some classes because they get removed, they get reset by Tailwind on things like input. So you don't actually see any border or anything like that. So it's a bit difficult to see if they're actually there or not. So border 2 grey. And you can see we've got an input box there now that we can actually type into, and that will actually be bound to the property of first name. And if you remember, we set up the initial values at the start here as well, so it's good practice to actually put these in here. So we're going to have first name. So we could set it to have a default value if we wanted to, but as I say, just good practice to have them as empty strings. And so the 3 fields we're going to have is first name is obviously the first one. We'll also have last name, and we'll also have email. Okay, so hopefully you can see how easy it is to actually add fields into your React forms with Formik. If we were doing this manually, we would have had to set some state for the first name value here, and we also would have had to create our own update handler as well, but that's what Formik's doing for us. It's basically doing a lot of that hard work for us. And so if we want to get the other input fields as well, we'll have last name here, and then finally just email. You go straight away, we've got our 3 input boxes, and then let's actually finally put a submit button in here as well. And there isn't any special Formik code that we need for this. We just simply use a HTML button. Let's set it as a type of submit, and then just say submit inside here. And there you go, we've got all of our components of our form. But let's actually tidy this up with some styling before we move any further. So we can apply some classes directly to the form itself. So we'll say the width is 64 units, which I'm not sure what that works out in rems in terms of Tailwind, but the documentation would tell us if we needed to know. And we're going to have it as a flex column, bit of box shadow on there just to liven things up. For the H2, we'll just apply a couple of classes here. So we'll say text center, the text is 2XL, and the font is bold. Okay, and so for each of these fields, we're going to add some styling to them, and we're also going to add a label in the next step as well. So let's put them all into their own separate divs here. So let's create one for each field. And let's format that nicely. And so for each of these divs here, let's add some classes to them. So for each one, we'll have some margin on the top and bottom. And we'll also set them as flex columns too, because this will hold the label, the input, and also the error messages when we get onto that in a moment. Okay, and then finally for the submit button as well, let's put some classes here too. So let's have margin on the top and bottom, and also some padding on the left and right, and some padding on the top and bottom. And we'll set the background to be blue 700 and the text to be white. And also when the button is disabled, we're going to set the opacity of that equal to 50%. And we'll also say some transitions for, let's just say for everything. And the duration is 300 milliseconds. Okay, so we'll be using Formik's helpers in a moment to actually say when the button is disabled or not, but at the moment it's not disabled, it'll just sit there and you can click it. And if all you actually need is some input boxes and you want to get the value out of it, you're not too worried about validation, this submit form function will actually get called when we click that submit button, and inside here the values will be given to us. So if we just, for example, for the moment console.log the values, and this values property here is complaining that it's just got a type of any, so let's just create a quick interface to manage those values there. So form values is an interface, and we've got first name is a string, last name is also a string, and or email will finally also be a string. So now we can use that interface here to specify what type of data is being submitted to the form. Okay, so if we open up our developer tools and head on over to the console, if we put some data into here and click submit, you can see that is being logged to the console because that's what's being provided to the submit form function, which is what we specified in the onSubmit property to Formik here. Okay, so in just a few simple steps, you can get a complete fully working form just by using Formik and the components that it provides. But we want to take that a step further by adding validation so that the user is typing the type of information in that we need. But just before we do that, let's add labels to our inputs as well, because we don't really know what we're typing in there at the minute. And I'm going to create a separate component for this. So there isn't a Formik label component as far as I know. So we're going to create our own here. So import React from React, and const label is a function, and export that as well. Okay, so this component is going to take a few properties in here. So we're going to have a property of text, which is basically going to be the text for the label. We'll also have the HTML4 attribute, which we'll specify. And we'll also have an optional property that we'll have, which will be required. So the question mark just says that it's optional here in TypeScript. And we'll use that to display an indicator whether the field, the input is actually required or not. So let's just destructure those from the props that have been passed in. Okay, and then I'm just going to return a fragment here to make things a bit neater in the response. I'm going to have a label, obviously. That's what the whole point of this component. And we'll have HTML4 is set to the HTML4 prop that's passed in. And then we'll have a span, and we'll just make the text in here to be bold, so font bold for Tailwind. And then we just output the text there. So there should always be some text for the label, but some of them may also be required as well. And if that required prop is actually true, so there's a true value being passed in. Actually, think about it, it's not required, should be a boolean here, not a string. Not that it matters too much, but just to be complete, we'll basically have another span there, which just displays an asterisk if it's required. Okay, so that's just a simple label component that we can now use in the form. Let's go back to the sign up form here, and let's just import the label. Okay, and let's add them into each of these divs that have got the inputs at the moment. So we'll have a label here. Oops. And we need to specify the HTML4 property, which is first name. And we should really probably put an ID in here as well, because the for attribute of a label actually links to the ID, not the name. So I think that should be the correct way of doing that. Okay, so we've got the HTML4. We need to then specify the text, of course, as well, which was first name. And I'm going to make this required for our purposes. So I'm just going to say required is true. Okay, so you can see in our form now we've got the label, and you can see the little asterisks to say that it's required as well. So let's just add those into the other divs that we've got for our input boxes too. So we're going to have another one here for last name, and change that to last name as well. So I said this wouldn't be required, so we can just remove that prop because it's optional. And let's not forget the ID in here as well. Okay, and then the final one in here for the email as well. So format that. And here it will be for email. And email is the text. We're going to make it required as well. And add the ID in here too. Okay, so we've got our 3 labels for our input boxes now. Right, so we're in a position now where we can add some validation to our sign up form now. So let's head on up to outside of the actual sign up form itself. And I'm going to create a new variable called sign up schema. And this is going to be basically using the Yup library, and what Yup can do is specify how a certain object should actually look. So in this case, the object that we're going to be sort of modeling is this values object that comes out here. So we know it's got a first name, last name and email, but what should be included in each of those? So although we know it's a string, how long should the string be? Should it be required or not? And that's the kind of thing that you can specify with Yup. So we're going to create an object, and we then specify the shape of the object to look like this. So we just specify the properties that we want. So we've got the first name, obviously, and we just say that's type string. And then what we can actually chain onto the string function is lots of different properties. So we can say it needs to have a minimum length of 3, for example. And if we don't get a minimum length of 3, if it's less than that, we could just say something like too short. And also correspondingly, we could say the max is 20 characters. And if we exceed that limit, we'll just say too long. Also, what we want to do is make it required as well. So we just say that the property within the object should be there. And the message, if it's not, is just to say it's required. So this is specifying the restrictions that are placed on the first name property. So for last name, we'll say again it should be a string. Now don't forget we said that this isn't required for the newsletter sign up in the form. But what we could do is say that if you do supply a value in this field, that it should have a minimum length. So we could say if you do supply a value to last name, it should be at least 3 characters. And again, we can say it's too short if not. But this time we're going to leave the .required call off here. So if this last name property is not there within the values object here, then it doesn't matter. And the final thing we've got is an email. So we'll say it's a Yup string. And we can specify an email function. And if it doesn't match whatever Yup thinks an email should look like, then we just say invalid email. And also we'll say it's required. So that email value must be present in the object. So that's the schema that we've got there. And what's really great about using Yup with Formik is once we've got the schema defined of how the object should look, literally all we need to do down here within Formik is to say, right, the validation schema is equal to the sign up schema that we've created. Okay, so that is actually being applied to the fields at the moment, but you've not got really any way of seeing those errors in there. So if we don't supply a name, for example, we need a way to actually display the error message. And if you remember at the start of the tutorial, we imported the error message component from Formik. So let's actually use that to display our error messages. And let's pop it into this first name section first of all. So we've got an error message. And the only thing you really need to supply is the name property, and you say the prop is the first name that we're linking this field to. And so now if we try and fill out the form, if we type something into the first name, obviously we don't see any error messages, but if we actually remove what we've typed in, you can see the error message component actually kicks in and displays that error message, which is what we just defined in the Yup schema above. Okay, so let's actually just add a bit of styling to that. We need to do a couple of things to make the styling work. The first thing is obviously to apply some Tailwind classes. And so this actually gets rendered as plain text at the moment, so we actually need to render it inside a div. So we pass a prop called component and specify div, it could be span as well, to the error message component. And now it's showing the error message in red text. And that's all you really need to do. That's another great thing about Formik, to display error messages. Again, you would need to do a bit of work if you wanted to handle this all yourself. So let's just copy these error message components here to the other fields. Okay, just a bit of auto formatting there, and set the last name for that one there. And then also in down here for the email, all we've got to do is update that name property there. Okay, so let's have another go at filling out the form. So if we leave the first name, it's we get the required message. If we just put one character in, it's obviously too short. in the last name there, if we leave it empty, it's okay because it's not required. But if we just put one character in, it shows us as being too short. And if we actually put a random string in there, you can see it's an invalid email. But if we put something which looks like an email in there, Yup is happy and Formik validates the form okay. Okay, and you'll notice in the console, if we try and submit that now, the onSubmit function won't work because we've got an invalid form in here. So it'd be quite nice to actually disable the submit button so that you can't actually click it, just so the user has to go and ensure the validation's all correct. And to do that, we actually need to get access to the Formik instance for the form so that we can check the state of it, the disabled state of the form. So what we can actually do inside of our Formik component here, if we actually just wrap this in a function that actually receives the Formik object, and if we just scroll down to where before Formik closes and just save that. So we've got access to this Formik object now, and you'll see that we can actually use a few properties on that to set the disabled state of this button down here. Okay, so we'll say the button is disabled when Formik dot is valid is false. So is valid will obviously return true if the form is valid. So if we negate that, when the form is not valid, we'll get a true value, and disabled will be set as true. We also might want to check if the form hasn't actually been touched yet, as in the user hasn't tried to enter any data, and the form is considered dirty when the user's typed something into one of the boxes. So again, if we negate that, we'll disable it when the user hasn't actually been anywhere near the actual form. So you can see now the button is actually disabled there, and now if we just type something into each of these fields, make sure we get something that looks a bit like an email address in here, and you can see the button's now enabled. And if we click it this time, you can see that we've got all of the form values that we've typed into the form. Okay, so that is the main meat of the tutorial. We've seen how to actually create inputs using Formik and then add validation on top of that, and hopefully you've seen how it's really simple. So what we're actually going to do now is create a Lambda function, a Netlify function, to actually submit this data that the user types in to the MailChimp marketing services using their API. Okay, so let's go and create that function now. In the project, we've already got a Netlify functions folder set up there. One of the great things about Netlify functions as well is you can actually write your function in pure TypeScript, and it will actually compile and run locally for you. And when you actually build and deploy it, it will be converted into JavaScript so it can run as well, but you don't need to actually worry about any of that compilation. It'll just be handled automatically for you. Okay, so I'm going to create a function called add email subscriber. Okay, and I just need to import one thing in here. I'm going to import the Axios library to actually send a network request to the MailChimp API. Again, this is something that's included in the repository, but you can just install it with the npm install command. And I want to create a handler which has the event object that's passed to it. We're going to be returning an object which will basically be the result from MailChimp or an error. So there's two bits of information we need to get working with MailChimp. The first thing is something called a list ID, and that is the ID of a list that you have within MailChimp, and I'll show you that in just a second. And the other thing we're going to need is an API key as well. Okay, so if you haven't used MailChimp before, you can go over to their site and actually sign up for a free account. It's mainly used as a marketing tool to actually send emails to customers, but we can actually use their API to actually sign up customers to a mailing list, which you can then email later on. But for our purposes for this tutorial, we're just going to actually use MailChimp to accept the result from our newsletter sign up and then store it within their database. Okay, so we need these two bits of information. We need the list ID. So if you go to this audience tab here, and if you go to the all contacts section here, we need to find this list ID, and if you go over into settings and go to audience name and defaults, you should see down here in this section you've got this audience ID, and that is essentially the list ID that we need. Obviously yours will be unique for your account, so let's just pop that into there as a variable. And the other thing we need to do is actually set up an API key as well. So you need to go to down here to your account section, and if you go to extras, you've got API keys here. And here we go, we're just going to create a new API key along here using this button here. And you can see it automatically creates us an API key, and we can copy that and then pop it into our handler function here. Now, of course, if you're doing this in a real project, then please put your sensitive information like your list ID and your API key into an environment variable or something similar. I'm just going to save it here for time and so you can see how it's being used. Okay, so with that information set up, what we need to do is first of all get the body from our event that's been passed in. So there's a property on there called body. Let's just grab that. And what we need to send to the MailChimp API is a couple of bits of information. And if we just go ahead and look at their documentation, you can see this is the API endpoint to actually add a new contact to the list. So it's this particular endpoint here. You can see we need the list ID within the URL. And we need to specify a couple of body parameters, so email address and also status, which should be subscribed. And then we've also got this merge fields down here as well. And we've also got these merge fields down here as well, which will actually take the things like the first name and the last name that we're going to supply from the form and pop that into the database that MailChimp's used to keep track of the users. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do in our body is just extract things like the email address, and I'm also going to send a property called merge fields as well, and just destructure that from the body. And the first thing we need to do is say if there's no email address, then we're going to be stuck really. We don't know who we're going to be adding to the database. So what we're going to do is return a status code of 400, and the body will basically just be a stringified version of an object. And we'll just send a message back saying, please provide an email address. So that shouldn't happen in our particular application, but if someone happens to bypass the form somehow and tries to submit some data without an email address, then this will just catch that. Okay, so we're in an async block here, so we'll create a new try catch block here, just so we can use the await keyword. So we're going to create a payload that we're going to send to MailChimp, and the first thing we need to do is to, send the email address and also the merge fields, and we also want to send a status of subscribed. Okay, so that's payload we're going to send. So we're going to use Axios to send that now. I'm going to send a post request with Axios. And the URL, you can actually find it within the documentation, but the important thing that you need to know about the URL for MailChimp is, you see this number here at the top where it's got US6, that's kind of the unique account ID for your account that you've signed up for them with. So you need to actually put that, make sure that matches in the URL that you're sending your API requests to. So the address is US6 in my case. api.mailchimp.com was version 3, and then if we look at the actual endpoint that we've got here, so it's lists, and then we want to substitute in here our list ID and members, and then we need to send the payload that we created as well, so that's the object that we created just up here. And also we need to send our API key as well, and we do that in a header. So we specify another object here, which is headers, and then we can just specify it's actually the authorization header that we need to send, and it's of type basic, and then we just pass in the API key, which we've got up here. Okay, so all being well, if that response is good, what we can do is from our function just return a status code of 200 to say everything was okay, and then in the body we just JSON stringify the data, which is the response from MailChimp. And of course, if there is an error, let's just log it out to the console, and we'll also return an object with a status code of 500, something went wrong, and also JSON stringify the error too. Okay, so that is our function complete. If you want to look at that in depth, then go over to the GitHub repository for this tutorial and just check out the main branch. What I'm actually going to do now is actually run that, and if you remember in our package.json file that we looked at the start, we've also got a start script for the API as well. So let's npm run start API. Okay, and that function is now listening for us. Okay, we just need to go to our front-end app and actually get that linked up. So now when we're actually submitting the form as well, what we're going to do is actually send a request to our function that we created. So let's keep that console.log there, but what I'm going to do is we want the first name, last name, and email from the values object, which is the result from the form. And we're going to, let's make this async here actually, so we can use the await keyword, because we'll use Axios to actually send the network request to the function. So we're going to create a similar looking payload on the front end here. So we want the merge fields to take the first and last name. And the default for MailChimp for the first name and last name is fname for the first name and lname for the last name. So these correspond to what MailChimp has in its database. There is somewhere in the documentation that has a list of the merge fields, and you can of course create your own as well. But just for the purposes of this tutorial, you just need to know that fname and lname are the field names that MailChimp has in its database. And we're going to link that to first name and last name from our form. And then of course, if you remember from the function, we had to have email_address, which matches the body parameter here in the API documentation, and that will just be the value of email that was typed into the form by the user. Okay, so that is the payload that we're going to send to our function, which in turn will get sent to MailChimp. And we're just going to make a post request here, and it will be to the .netlify folder, functions, and add email subscriber, I think it was called. Let me just pass the payload. And I'm not going to do anything too fancy if this actually does go through. I'll leave it to you to decide what should happen, but I'm just going to put an alert box in here just to say the contact details were added successfully. Of course, you might want to do something along the lines such as show a notification, or maybe hide the form after the user submitted their details. But as I say, I'll leave that up to you. We're just demonstrating how you would actually submit this data here. So let's close this off with our catch block here. And again, we'll just do an alert here and say error.message just to see what was going on, if there is any problems. Okay, so let's go back over to our front-end app here, and let's just put some details in here. So we'll say the first name is Fred, last name is Jones, and we'll have fred@juniordevelopercentral.com. Let's just open up our developer tools here and click submit. Oh, and we did actually get an error here. We've got a 500 status code here. Let's just have a look what's going on in the terminal output. Okay, so in our add email subscriber, handler.handler is not a function, and I think that might be because we didn't export it. Okay, yeah, so we've created our handler function, but we need to actually export it from this file, otherwise Netlify won't be able to find it. So let's just export that. Okay, and that's rebuilt that, and it's running again. So we should just be able to hit the submit button again here. Okay, and now we've got a message saying the contact details were added successfully. So just click OK here. And if we go over back into MailChimp now, and if we go back to our audience section and to all contacts, you can see here we've got our Fred@JuniorDeveloperCentral email address with the merge fields of first name and last name of Fred and Jones. So we've successfully created our function and linked it to MailChimp, and we've also then linked it to our sign-up form using the Formik library submission process. So there's just one last thing that I'm just going to do to finish this off. So once we've actually submitted an email to our newsletter, it might be a good idea to actually reset this form. If you want to sign up other people, as I said, it's down to you really how you handle that, but one thing you might want to do is reset things. So what we're going to do here in this submit form function, when that gets called, there is another argument you can get access to, which is an instance of Formik, pretty much like we did in the template to disable the submit button earlier on. So Formik has got a type of Formik helpers if you're using TypeScript, but we also need to specify the type of values that are in there. So it's a generic type, and we specify the form values, which is just basically our interface that we created earlier on. And so with that Formik variable that we've got access to now, when our contact details were added successfully, added with 1D on the end, we can just say Formik reset form. So let's try that one more time. So let's say Dave Jones and Dave at juniordevelopercentral.com, and if we hit submit, okay, the contact details were added successfully, and when we click OK, the form is now reset to its initial state, ready to accept some more newsletter signups. Okay, so that is it for this tutorial. Hopefully you found it useful. We had the introduction to Formik and how you can quickly create a form, even if you just want to submit some data to your app. And then we layered on validation on top of that easily and quickly with Yup by creating a schema for how the object should look within the form. And then finally we used Formik's abilities to submit a form to link our sign-up form to the function that we created, which in turn then linked it to the MailChimp API. Okay, so as always, thanks very much for watching. If you do have any questions, feel free to pop a comment below. And just before you go, don't forget to subscribe to support the channel and so you don't miss out on any future tutorials. And hopefully I'll see you in the next React tutorial.